I want to end today with a discussion of a couple of cases in Central Asia. Hopefully you found the videos interesting at looking at the individual level impacts of water resources and the difficulty in being able to maintain them. And before I get into my spiel, I want to turn it over to you with the third lecture question today. Do you think the Kyrgyz wells would be more likely to be maintained by increasing institutional spending and support, i.e. a top-down approach that requires centralized planning and spending, or by spending on public information campaigns describing who the water belongs to, i.e. a bottom-up approach? And I'd be interested to hear your thinking as to why. This is one of those fundamental tensions and implications of the stories we tell about environmental factors linking to human security and conflict. Do you think what's actually driving the relationships or the tensions or the potential solutions to those tensions come from centralized government or international government planning and spending, or through creating awareness and buy-in from the individual level, a bottom-up approach? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. For those of you who are not taking my class, you can leave comments below. For those of you who are taking my class, please leave them comments in Waddle under week 7. So let's go ahead and get into Central Asia. This is a really fascinating part of the world. It's one in which people, I think, don't spend enough time talking about in 2022, or I guess a bit in 2002, 20 years ago. But for those of you who are history buffs or are interested in major power rivalries and conflicts, the whole great game between Russia and the British in the 19th century is one of the most fascinating stories. Peter Hopkirk wrote a great book called The Great Game, showing the escalating tensions and interactions between Russian spies and government forces and the British spies and government actors coming from India, as the stakes were raised in trying to fill in the map of global control during this age of colonialization and exploration. But this area here, in which you have the Amu Darya and river area here in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan, or you can visualize it a bit more here, kind of shows the importance of these river systems to the economic livelihoods of people, as you could see in the videos earlier, of these different countries. There was recently a war between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan a couple of months ago. It'd be an interesting source for a research paper or project, is one that didn't get really any attention that I saw in the Australian or US media, but it shows the ongoing border tensions between even developing countries in parts of the world that you might not be familiar with. And I think the red lines here being international borders. We're going to touch on Turkmenistan a bit earlier. We talked about it in a previous week. These are areas that were incredibly strategically important, going back centuries, going back 1,000 years, with the Silk Road going from across Asia from east to west and back. You have this incredible cultural and linguistic histories that are really fascinating to study. I think for me, in trying to understand the crazy and tortuous boundaries that we saw in the videos between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, the Fergana Valley, but then also in other parts of the region with Tajikistan, you have to understand a little bit about Soviet politics in the 20th century. So a couple of points I think that are relevant to understand the evolution of both resource usage and tensions between the different countries in the region is going back to Stalin, from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 through the 1930s. Stalin, as he solidified control, divided Central Asia into a number of different Soviet republics. The borders there were designed to be able to split up ethnic groups across states, so that one state wouldn't be disproportionately centrally controlled by one group as a way to divide and conquer different groups. This ended up ending in 1991 as 15 Soviet republics ended up declaring independence from the USSR. There was a lot of holdovers, as we saw in Turkmenistan, of leaders, Soviet leaders became presidents after these republics became independent, as with Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, not quite as long as Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. These areas depend on those water sources that come from the Pamirs and from the mountains in the south. So there was, quite quickly after independence, one of the major areas in which these countries wanted to hammer out agreements was an interstate commission for water coordination. And this kind of shows the different strategic interests of upstream and downstream countries, because as it was being negotiated, Kyrgyzstan wanted to store water in spring and autumn and release this water in the winter to spring for hydropower production, which, when this demand for electricity was highest during that winter to spring period. It gets quite cold in a lot of these higher parts of the world. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan were definitely the users of more of the water for irrigation, and they were interested in water during that kind of main growing season between April and September. And so they didn't really have the storage capacity in the destination states, and so they wanted to try to regulate when the water was being let down. And so they signed an agreement to set release targets in 98. It took 6 years to be able to hammer out all these agreements, and Tajikistan joined it the next year. I think directly related to the Fergana Valley and the discussions earlier, this is the Tashkent Reservoir in Kyrgyzstan. Absolutely beautiful lake. I think I drove around it. I never actually visited as much as the major Lake Isikol in the east. But you can see the Tashkent Dam here, and how a lot of the water would kind of flow down into the Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan, as well as how close it was to the borders in Kazakhstan up to the north as well. And Lake Isikol would be the main lake to the east, and the capital Bishkek, therefore, in the north, quite near to Kazakhstan. There's the Kazakh capital there in Almaty. So you can see how close a lot of these capitals and borders were to each other. This northern part of Lake Isikol, if you ever have a chance to go, there's a lot of old Russian resorts that were left after independence, that they used to be able to, the Soviet leaders would be able to go there for vacations. So there's a lot of, Sochi wasn't the only place that they would go for vacations. But the significance of the Tashkent Dam, connecting to an article that you might have come across if you focused on this research for your papers, is showing this release targets from this Tashkent Dam. And you can see over the different reservoirs. So the Tashkent is this distribution right here, but you had, over the course of the year, quite dramatic releases. Like in Tashkent, they ended up releasing a large amount of it in that kind of early spring to summer period, which was more what Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan wanted, while you had other ones that were kind of more spread out over time than these ones that had more dramatic piece release schedules. But it's been an ongoing source of tension between the countries, connecting to that Al Jazeera video from 2019 that I linked to. So Lake Tashkent, the Tashkent Reservoir was right there, and I don't know how many of you have been following Kyrgyz politics. Some amazing musicians come from there as well. But on the road through the Fergana Valley, two of the main areas in which people live are Osh and Jalalabad, and these received a lot of international attention in 2010. Because of the ethnic clashes that happened around Osh and Jalalabad. It started over local level violence over land, similar to what we'll see, what we saw in Mali and what we'll see in Ethiopia a bit later. An Uzbek collective farm, the ethnic Kyrgyz and Uzbeks who existed across both sides of the border. As we saw with the videos, people used to be able to migrate and move across the border, and it wasn't really that salient. After widespread clashes, the president of Kyrgyzstan stepped down in 2010. The violence led to the deaths of about 420 people, and over 80,000 people were displaced. Uzbekistan sent troops over the border and opened the border to Uzbek refugees in order to try to allow them to be able to leave safely. And this president stepping down in the aftermath of clashes ended up having ramifications for future presidents that also stepped down after protests that followed on. So once you get these ethnic clashes that were in a lot of ways clamped down by the stability of the relative stability of the Soviet system during the Cold War, once that genie is taken out of the bottle and these clashes can escalate, it can lead to violence that can have national level implications. Now, there's so much interesting about this region. I wanted to touch on a couple of other interesting cases that you might not have come across. So Uzbekistan, you see here the Fergana Valley was here in that eastern part of the country, and the capital city of Tashkent is in the eastern part of the country. But you have this huge swath, a relatively empty area here, and this is where the Aral Sea used to be. I mentioned Stalin a bit earlier. As his effort to try to develop the Soviet economy in order to compete with the U.S. and the West, there was a decision to make Uzbekistan one of the world's leading cotton-producing areas, and so a lot of the water that came from the Amu Darya that ended up flowing into the Aral Sea was diverted, and so what now is two different much smaller lakes. Used to be a larger lake, and I mentioned earlier that the Silk Road used to go through this area. So you have this movement through to these major, amazing historical cities. If you ever had the chance to go, including Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva. Where's Khiva? Khiva's up there. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of cotton production. I study human trafficking and forced labor by the Uzbek government to allow for cotton production to continue in the scale that it has. Didn't necessarily end at the end of the Soviet period. You have a lot of instances of government workers being forced to work in cotton producing areas of the country during the peak producing season. People would be bused from Tashkent to other parts of the country to be able to work, to be able to produce. But I wanted to spend a little time talking about a much smaller area that I almost covered it there. The area of Moniak right there. Let's get to these kind of more excluded areas that are relatively empty. But I wanted to show that you have major cotton producing areas around the world. You have China, India, the United States, of course, large populations, large production, Brazil, Pakistan for cotton producers, and then Uzbekistan is seventh now, which you have Australia slightly below that as well, with much different kind of industrialization capacity. You see a lot of it, as you saw with the videos, is being picked by hand. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Aral Sea and the town of Moniak, a place I had to haul water for weeks to, and a topic and an area that highlights a number of issues we've covered in this class about scarcity, about the importance of political decisions, economic realities in order to produce to be internationally competitive, the Aral Sea and the shrinkage of it, and the unanticipated health consequences of it are something that I don't think gets talked enough about. This quote here: poisonous dust storms kicked up by strong winds across the dry and polluted seabed give rise to a multitude of chronic and acute illnesses amongst the few residents who have chosen to remain. I honestly don't remember who wrote that, but it is a pretty bleak kind of area at the end of the world in which you have uh, most of the people who have left. The people who did used to live quite well there during the Soviet days were fishing, but now that there isn't as much water and of course no fish in you saw with the previous map how far Moynyak is now from the current Aral Sea. You see that the water isn't coming back. You can just walk around the desert sands of what used to be the Aral Sea. There is what used to be an island in the middle of the Aral Sea that ended up poisoning Moynyak and a lot of its citizens, and is on the list of one of the top 9 most inhospitable places in the world. It is Vojvodenia Island, aka Anthrax Island, an island that used to be in the middle of the Aral Sea, that because of the drawing off the water for cotton production is now connected to the rest of the land. What's so bad about it? It was a site of Soviet biowar experiments, often against animals. The whole area is contaminated with anthrax, smallpox, bubonic plague. Local rodents are thought to have picked up some of these diseases and some resistant strains of the disease. The laboratory was established in 1948, shortly after the end of World War II. At its height, over 1,500 people actually live there. It's currently inhabited, and the site was completely abandoned after the end of the Cold War. There was efforts, I mean, it's not the only Anthrax Island. After the end of the Cold War, there was one on a small island off the coast of Scotland. I'm not sure if you heard about. They had this huge effort to decontaminate the island in Scotland that required removal of all the topsoil off the top of the island and sterilization of the dirt there. After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. played a role in trying to secure nuclear weapons facilities in the former Soviet republics, like in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. In Uzbekistan and this area bordering Kazakhstan, it was biowarfare. Some of these, the U.S. came in and tried to decontaminate some of the soil surrounding the production facilities, but to date, there hasn't been any systematic exploration of the laboratories themselves. There's videos of the laboratories that look like they were quickly abandoned, and petri dishes of bioweapons that were unbroken, some broken, that still exist there. And there's a real worry that, as we've learned in the last couple of years, about the potency and the potential for inadvertent leakage of viruses that could shape the world today. I think this is an area in which it doesn't get enough attention. If you're interested, there's a lot of videos on YouTube. I've linked to this one in the description of this video, and you can find it here. That provides a bit of history about the island, about the geopolitical realities of it, and the potential impact that it could have on the kind of economic and human development that we've talked about in this class. It's kind of bleak, but it's something that is a political choice that governments can choose to pay attention to or not, or spend scarce resources or not. Scotland ended up removing all of the topsoil, and in this coordinated top-down effort to make the area safe, not something that's happened, or the funding hasn't come from abroad sufficiently to be able to contaminate the area. It was top secret during the Cold War. No one had any idea, or wasn't public until after the end of the Cold War, and is now. In the 90s, there was a lot of discussion about trying to keep the loose nukes secure, but the bioweapons facilities, there was some mention of it, but it hasn't really received as much attention. So it's something I wanted to discuss as a potential legacy of political decisions to remove water for economic production can end up having potential dire effects. And talking about cotton, one last point about Central Asia, and to connect it back to one of the case studies we've already talked about. Turkmenistan, as we talked about before, is more well known for oil and natural gas, and that huge strategic shift that the previous president made from trying to export most of the oil to Russia to China, as well as established connections to Iran, but they also are the 9th largest source of cotton. And this actually, I think it's now outside of the 9th, according to that last graph that I showed you. But it's made possible by Turkmenistan's allocation of the Amudarya runoff in that agreement that I talked about in a previous slide. And so you do have the 2nd largest export commodity of this very isolated state coming from these water resources from neighboring states, according to this international agreement. I also wanted to mention that, surprise, surprise, the early election that I mentioned was being called. They actually held the election at the end of last month in March, and the former president's son was reelected. It took a while, took longer than expected to release the results. I'll put a video in the description if you're curious about how that went. There really wasn't that much coverage at all. I only found press reports from countries in the region that had strategic or cultural connections to Turkmenistan in either Turkey or in China. But yeah, he won 73% of the vote, which was substantially down from his father, who won 97% of the vote. And one of the first things he said to the media as he was casting his vote was that he was interested in maintaining private economic production within the country. So taking a step back now, connecting it to the motivating question for today: in what ways can water affect conflict? This could be an entire class. I know it's been research papers for you and for other students who've taken the class, but I think it's important with the characteristics of this resource, as with other resources like people that we talked about in the previous 2 weeks, and other natural resources we'll touch on next week and the weeks after. Where is the resource? How it comes and goes, how much it's treated, and who uses it, both across borders and within borders, and most directly, how it has implications for political and economic balances of power within states. So I'll conclude by saying that water scarcity, it's a challenge to both intrastate civil war and interstate conflict and stability. However, most of the research that I've come across and that we've read for this week suggests limited evidence for direct effects between water and conflict. Water can also provide incentives for cooperation, as we're going to see in week 12 of this semester, as well as you saw with the cooperation between the stands in the 1990s in Central Asia. And there's more evidence for interactive effects with political and economic development and stability, that you have this opportunity argument or grievances and greed could also be brought into it, that you need these background structural resource conditions interacting with more dynamic political or economic or social conditions to really have that kind of heady explosive effect that could lead to violence. And so this is but one way in 1 week to kind of take the step back and connect something that we use day to day, the important realities that a lot of us take for granted, can be the hardest to see and talk about. The resources that we all depend on, clean air and water, have been themes that we've come through in this class. And I connected it to case studies in Central Asia, but you can connect it. I've had students in this class write papers on water allocation and protection in Australia, in Asia Pacific, in a whole bunch of other different regions. Haven't had anyone write a paper about California. Maybe I need to do that. But anyway, this is the end of today's discussion on water and conflict. I'd be interested to hear what you think for my students in the workshop, or for those of you who aren't my students, in the comments below. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.